an ancient land, echoes of a distant past, traces of a warlike culture.
They spend their life killing people and engaged in warfare.
A profession of arms, a martial life, born to serve.
The Gallowglass, they were terrifying.
Warriors who for centuries dominated, with armour, axe and sword.
Be swift, be brave, be sure on your feet.
An inspirational past.
Medieval Ireland, it's a land of legend.
Serving lords and kings and the names of their fathers. The Warlords of Ireland, the Gallowglass. The medieval world, the 5th to the 15th century. Tim Sutherland is one of Britain's most experienced archaeologists. He and a team of specialists try to understand medieval life by exploring the realm of the medieval dead.
We have a classic view of the storybook medieval life. We don't hear the stories about the common man trying to keep his family alive. Archaeologically speaking, we can now focus in on the medieval dead people. You couldn't help almost look through their eyes thinking, what did they see? How did they die?
The Gallowglass were among the most fearsome of all warriors of the Middle Ages. Their appearance alone was awe-inspiring, designed to strike terror in their enemies' hearts. On the battlefield they were formidable, the prized elite force, the last line of defence, when there was no one else whom to turn. It was an ancestral calling, a lifetime of tradition and training, ritual and preparation, for the one great fight, which might one day be their last. Their world is all but lost to us now, veiled in myth, almost entirely lost to written records. Now we journey back through the centuries, examining the clues that remain, as well as new research, breaking new ground, bringing light on the lost way of life of the world of the Galloglass in the land of medieval Ireland.
Medieval Ireland to us now is like an alien landscape in many ways. It's very different to us, the Gaelic culture that a lot of places had. But yet we see it everywhere. It's something that we touch and experience in our wider landscape.
I suppose what I love about medieval Ireland is its complexity. I think when people look back on the Middle Ages, they think it is all simple and it's all black and white. But medieval Ireland, its layers and its complexities, they're continually unfolding before our eyes. And, you know, it's a wonderful, rich tapestry.
Medieval Ireland, really, it's a land of legend. It's so rich in its culture.
The history of Ireland is rich and varied, yet it's little known compared with Britain or other parts of Western Europe.
There are very few places in Europe that are as evocative as Ireland in the medieval period. It's a landscape that's almost still mystical in that it's not really well known about. It's right on the periphery of Europe. And of course the archaeology is usually seen as the Celtic period. It's the peripheral archaeology as well.
Written accounts are relatively few, so it's largely through this archaeology that we know what we know of Ireland's past. The evidence tells of strongly defined cultures, from the Bronze and Iron Ages, even into the early Christian era. Despite the great cloak of the Dark Age, these were the times of Gaelic myths and heroes. But it was the 10th century and the coming of the Norsemen that brought the greatest change. Viking Dublin was a major European settlement, a prosperous trading port. A century and a half later, after their conquest of England, It was the Normans who invaded, building hundreds of castles and cathedrals. Over the following 2 centuries, Ireland was divided between Anglo-Norman Irish and Gaelic Irish. Families and dynasties evolved on each side. Traditional rivalries that would last hundreds of years. Even to those familiar with the story of medieval Europe, the Gallowglass are relatively little known. Yet their fearsome reputation holds strong.
The Gallowglass is a very interesting form of troops from this later medieval period. It seems to be a development of a much earlier, perhaps Viking idea, which survives in certain areas, most notably part of Northern Ireland and the west of Scotland. Probably of very localised significance, but then quite suddenly emerges on a wider stage, as it were, and axe-armed, pretty heavily armoured infantry, and big. They seem to be big fellas. They had a remarkable impact.
Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland's oldest university. It's home to the Book of Kells and many conferences on the story of medieval Ireland. Professor Sean Duffy is an expert on this period. He's devoted much time to studying the Galloglass and their place in native Irish society.
If you were a student of medieval Ireland and you're interested in what makes medieval Ireland tick, you have to learn about Gallowglass and you have to factor them into your calculations, because they're there, that they begin to arrive into Ireland in the 13th century.
The late 1200s. A turbulent time in the turbulent history of Ireland and the British Isles. But where did the Gallowglass come from?
The word Gallowglass comes from the Irish words Gallowglass. Usually when you see that written down, it's translated as foreign warrior, because the assumption is these people came to Ireland and they were foreigners. But in fact, the Irish for the Hebrides is the Inche Gall, and Gallowglass means a warrior, or a vassal, in fact, a military vassal from the Hebrides. And in the Middle Ages, the Hebrides and most of Scotland was considered by the Irish to be part of the greater Irish world.
Ireland and Scotland, particularly the Western Isles, had both been colonised by Scandinavian Vikings through the Dark Ages. Now the wars between Norman England and Scotland, the wars of independence, caused great upheaval.
It might be to do with conditions in the Highlands of Scotland, where there's a lot of political turbulence, and especially in the period of the Anglo-Scottish War, the time of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce and so on, where, factions within Scotland took sides, some lost out, and they had to find a new home for themselves, and they looked to Ireland.
Scots, dispossessed or just in search of new homelands. The kings of Ireland, losing their struggle against the Anglo-Norman invaders, welcomed these foreign warriors.
Irish kings, they needed a new weapon in their armoury if they were trying to oppose the Anglo-Normans. And the Gallowglass provided the perfect solution to their problems. And in a sense, you can say, therefore, that they helped to tilt the balance in Ireland in favour of the native Irish.
The Galloglass were the levellers in 13th century Ireland. They took root and dominated Irish battlefields of the medieval age. Battlefields, and also the politics of the Irish kings who employed them.
They weren't mercenaries in the sense that we tend to use the term as people whose loyalty was fickle, who could be bought and sold, and who did what their master's bidding. If you look at the activities of Galloglasses throughout the ages in Ireland, they are very closely aligned with the political factions that exist in the country.
Generations of Galloglass served the same political dynasties for hundreds of years. Name and honour were everything.
You don't hear, you hardly ever hear certainly, of them betraying the trust of their employer, selling their services off to the highest bidder. They are They are part of the factional politics of Gaelic Ireland and indeed of Anglo-Ireland. Because after the Gallowglass have been in Ireland for 150 or 200 years, they are not just being hired by Irish lords, but by the descendants of the Anglo-Norman invaders of Ireland, these Anglo-Irish lords, and they work for them as well. So eventually, by the end of the Middle Ages, they have filtered all the way through the country.
External commentators who saw them emphasised how you couldn't compete successfully in Irish warfare unless you had a troop of Galloglass at your disposal. Yet as with so many aspects of the medieval world, the real details of the Galloglass are mostly lost to us today, because they left almost no written records of their own. That's why archaeologist Tim Sutherland has come to Ireland to find out more.
To a certain degree, Ireland's a bit of a time capsule. You know, you drive across the landscape and you can see things in the landscape that have remained probably unchanged for hundreds or thousands of years.
There may be precious few documents, but the Galloglass were encapsulated in another kind of historical record.
Our mental image of a Galloglass comes from images of them that have survived, for the most part, on memorial stones. There are Irish kings whose graves are adorned by figure sculpture. In some instances, this records Galloglass. And you might think it's an odd thing to have on a grave because it's showing soldiers in their uniforms. But if you think of the purpose of the effigy in question is to show the status of the king, and if you show him as being a man who had Galloglass in his pay, you're adding to his status in the eyes of his community.
Connaught, in Central Ireland. Roscommon Abbey was founded in the 13th century by King Felim O'Connor, who was buried here himself in 1265. It's not known if this effigy is the king himself or one of his successors. The carved front of the tomb shows the figures of 8 Galloglass. Their appearance is striking, unlike any other medieval effigies. These aren't knights in suits of armour as we're used to. They're almost figures from fantasy. They wear the archetypal armour that remained the same for centuries. Long mail coat, bassinet helm, and each carries a sword or great axe. They're gaunt, staring, foreboding. This martial daring was a vital part of the Gallowglass ethos, and was reflected in every aspect of his appearance. The hair, short cropped, with a thick fringe or forelock, the glib, marked him out as an outlaw to the later English Tudors. His dress and equipment too were ritualised. The manner in which they were worn or carried hardly changed across centuries. The basic living garment was a linen shirt or tunic, dyed with saffron, called in Gaelic the leina. It could be made from many yards of material, with voluminous folds and sleeves for warmth. The Galloglass went either bare-legged, red-shanked, or wore narrow woolen hose and leather shoes. Over the leina, he wore a knee-length arming jack, a cotoon, quilted and waxed by the gambeson or acketon of a medieval European man-at-arms. Perhaps the most expensive and prestigious part of the harness was the mail shirt. It was made of hundreds, thousands of riveted iron links and worn long to protect the thighs. This was called a lurach. It was fitted and belted, so the wearer wouldn't be slowed down or hindered in combat. A mail collar or standard, the scabble. The scian, like the Scottish scian dubh, was the sidearm, inscribed and individual to every man. But the other symbolic weapon, like any medieval knightly figure, is the sword. Helmets could be simple iron caps or skulls, or more elaborate conical bassinets, sometimes with a peak, and they were called the Cathbar. The great two-handed axe, the Tua, was the symbol of Galloglass power, the terror weapon on the battlefield, for whirling and smashing at armoured foes. The Roscommon tomb and others across Ireland show swords, and like the other aspects of the Gallowglass, they're clearly different to conventional European medieval blades, but they are similar to those from one nation. Scottish broadswords, like the great two-handed claymore, bear some resemblance to Galloglass swords, perhaps a relic of the shared heritage of the two cultures. Yet the swords associated with Galloglass are smaller than claymores. They're often finer, single-handers or hand-and-a-halves, called halflangs. Edinburgh swordmaker Paul MacDonald is more than familiar with Scottish blades. Now he's come to Dublin to learn about their Irish cousins.
Here, Paul, late medieval swords, and some of them you might be familiar with. So the National Museum of Ireland has probably the largest collection of Gallowglass weapons anywhere in the world, really, certainly anywhere in Ireland. These were all found in Ireland, but a lot of them could as easily have been found in Scotland.
Yeah, these are fantastic. I've already here seeing crossover between the early medieval Highland styles from the halflang into the claymore. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
Great examples. Beautiful.
The Galloglass and his weapons are usually thought of as being overbearing, for cleaving, anything but subtle.
The classic picture of Gallowglass that we get from the historical sources is of big men, big strong men wielding big swords, making a big flourish. And to some extent the archaeology, the actual surviving weapons, bears that out. We do have a number of big heavy swords. But the interesting thing is that we also have many swords of the same type, but that seem to point to something different because they're smaller, they're single-handed swords, and they're lighter.
Paul is intrigued by this. He suspects that there may have been more to the Galloglass's martial skills than mere brawn. There might be a clue to this in a common feature seen in many of the museum's swords. Medieval blades have a weighted pommel at the end of the grip. It's a counterbalance to the weight of the blade, and it makes the weapon easier to wield. Yet many swords here have either no pommel remaining, or they're hollow, with no weighting at all.
I've seen evidence of the hollow pommels in certain Scottish and Highland swords especially. It's been suggested, certainly, yeah, were they lead filled or such.
Yes.
And there's one that I know of that's been x-rayed and found to be about 3/4 filled with lead.
That's interesting, that's interesting. We've no evidence of lead in any of our pommels to date, but it might be worth looking for it again.
Is it possible to have a closer look?
I think it might be, yes, yeah.
Great.
It'll be the first time ever that anyone's attempted to work out how it was made. Getting to grips like this with one of the precious few surviving Galloglass blades is pretty special.
This sword was found in the River Barrow in County Kildare, just a bit south of Dublin.
It's an interesting form of pommel, I think really only seen on swords of this type of this period. To my eye, I'm already thinking about how this plays in the hand,
Yes.
how this works in the hand.
Yes.
A light pommel to me would suggest a light blade,
Yeah.
a light fast blade.
Yes.
A really
Yes.
effective cutting blade, be swift in the hand. I would imagine these were, pretty fearsome, fast, swift blades in their day.
Right, right.
To my eyes, this is what this is already saying, but there's really only one way to know for sure.
Sure, sure.
Paul carefully records the sword. Though it's not survived completely intact, he'll take these measurements back to Edinburgh to begin the recreation. The potent image of the Galloglass is prevalent throughout Irish folklore and beyond. Galloglass appear in traditional art and literature, even in Shakespeare. And now these archetypal Irish warriors have a continued influence in film and television. Tim's come to Ballyjames Duff in County Cavan. He's here to meet Irish film industry armourer and prop maker, Boyd Rankin.
So how long have you been doing this then?
Oh, about 20 years now. I am by profession a retired pharmacist. I like to say I'm a retired drug dealer, but people look at you. I have a love of history, but more importantly, I have a love of making things. And history has provided the inspiration for the things that I make. I make weapons for film, for television, for museums, for heritage centres. Not just weapons, but we make other sorts of props and everything and anything. In fact, in some ways, a jack of all trades. When we're working in film and television and things like that, sometimes you want something a little bit oddball, something unusual. And that's where I've drawn the inspiration from Irish history. I'm also, I'm a wee boy growing up. I like all the things that go bang. I like bows and arrows. I like swords. So the whole thing has come together in where I am today.
So how does the medieval Gallowglass material inspire your work then?
Well, in fact, actually thinking about it, Irish is so unique. Style of dress, if you go back into native Irish and Irish weapons, some of the weapons that were used are not used anywhere else. And if we think of one particular very famous type of Irish warrior, was the Galloglass.
Right.
Now think of it, the vision people have of these big, hefty, strong men.
So from what you say, it appears that you're more rooted in the reality than the sort of fantasy side of this weapons and warfare.
Take something like Game of Thrones. We were working with various characters and various styles of weapons, and then there was the Mountain, Gregor Clegane, and he was big, and he had to have a big, impressive weapon. And when I saw the cast member in his costume, he to me, he was Galloglass. He was huge. So immediately I thought, Albert Dure.
Right, the Galloglass picture.
The Galloglass, the Irishman abroad. And so I made a very large Galloglass sword, ring-hilt sword. The other thing that, well, I'm Irish. It's an American series being filmed in Ireland, and it was just that little stamp of Irishness into it as well.
A Galloglass's days were taken up in preparation for what he could expect to face in the service of his client lord. Warriors might be quartered in a village or throughout a local area, depending on their duties. For battles, they were usually grouped together en masse.
When we think of a Galloglass, if you hear of an army that has a troop of 80 Galloglass, you have to double or triple or quadruple that, because each Galloglass soldier had 2 or 3 boys who carried his weapons for him. Such was such were the weight of the mail coats that he carried with him, and the weight of the weaponry that he had with him. That they had a couple of these gillies or servant boys who did that. So they were probably apprentice Galloglass themselves.
Each fully fledged fighter would be attended by at least 1 or 2 of these novices, sometimes known as Kern. Like squires to a knight, they were part of the Galloglass's team, fetching and carrying, and maintaining his armour and weapons. But most importantly, they had to learn how to fight. Every day, they train in the martial skills required of a Galloglass, sparring both unarmed and armed. Only when they'd mastered wooden weapons would they be allowed to train with steel, with swords or the axe. Very little else is known about the hard lives these men lived.
Even little things like how they were paid, and they were probably paid in cattle, which was the currency of Gaelic Ireland in the later Middle Ages. But how those cattle were then converted to an income for them, were they slaughtered, were they brought home? We don't know how the mechanics of that on the ground. We know that they were hired for a 3-month period at a time. The reward was given to the commander, and then he presumably fed his troops and maintained his troops. But the small print of it, it's completely lost to us at this remove.
The Gallowglass prospect had to learn the skills of patrolling and moving through the landscape, as important as fighting itself. Hunting was a natural means of training for this. They'd come to know the use of the bow, or the light javelin traditionally favoured by Galloglass. All vital skills, for much of the military activity of the Galloglass centred on raiding or counter-raiding.
For the most part, these are cattle raids. And if I march into your territory, I steal your cattle and I make off with them, then you're going to come after me. And so the really important positions in the army will be in the rear. That's the place of honour in an army. And that's where Gallowglass were. So the Irish Cairn, they were in the vanguard making off with the cattle. They weren't up to much else. That was their function. It was the Gallowglass who came behind then, guarding the rear.
On the battlefield, it was the same.
These were guys who kind of stood their ground, one at a time. We know that they were very often used as the last line of defense. They were brought in maybe if things were going wrong and you needed to withdraw your forces. The Galloglass are the guys who will make a stand when everyone else can get to safety behind them.
It was a role whose demands few would envy. It hardly mattered. This was a warrior caste, open only for the elite.
It's important to remember about Gallowglass that a person couldn't decide to become a Gallowglass. Couldn't apply for the job of being a Gallowglass and train. You were a Gallowglass because your father was a Gallowglass, whose grandfather was a great-grandfather. These are hereditary dynasties. We have to think of them like that. But to that extent, they are very typical of Gaelic society in Ireland because everything was hereditary. There were hereditary families of lawyers, hereditary medical families, and indeed hereditary clerical families. You became a priest because your father was a priest and your grandfather was a priest. So they operated within the structures of Gaelic society.
Just as the vocation of Galloglass was handed down through generations, so too were the bitter rivalries and feuds between clan, tribe or family, old scores to be settled when the time came.
As the Middle Ages wear on, the Galloglass are found all over Ireland, and they're not just confined to the Gaelic lords. They work in the employ of the English lords of Ireland as well. A classic instance of that, for example, occurs at the Great Battle of Knockdoe in County Galway at the start of the 16th century.
Knockdoe, Knukdua, the hill of the axes, the time when many an old score was settled. Fought on the 19th of August 1504, this was the last and the largest medieval battle in Ireland. Tim's here to work with Irish archaeologist Damien Shields. They're planning a geophysics survey, but first they have to select which area to target. Frank Kearney and John J. Cronin are on hand to lend their historical and local knowledge.
When I turned up here, as someone who had an MA in history, I looked into the history of the local area and suddenly discovered that the biggest Gallowglass battle in Britain or Ireland took place on this hill right beside it, and everybody knew about it except me.
For me, I was always looking down at the top of Knockdoe Hill from once the day I was born because it was outside the back door. And I suppose sometimes people around the hill of Knockdoe have sort of expressed their, I suppose, dissatisfaction, for the want of a better word, that it has never taken its place in Irish history that many people sort of feel it should have, because it certainly was one of the single bloodiest battles that took place on one particular day, in the case of Irish history.
This battle is on a scale that was not seen in Ireland before 1504 and would not be seen in Ireland again until the late 17th century.
Knockdoe was a meeting point between the old and the new, the end of the medieval era and the dawning of the post-medieval.
There's very few battles in Irish history where you have such an amalgamation of people from all over the country, and Old English, Irish. There's a real hodgepodge of what Ireland had to offer at that period.
You have Gaelic Irish and Old English on one side fighting Gaelic Irish and Old English on the other.
In one sense, this is a contest between two of Ireland's great lords. They and align on either side their traditional allies. So both of them have native Irish allies fighting for them. And those native Irish allies in turn, of course, have their Gallowglass forces. So there are Gallowglass forces fighting on both sides in that battle.
You have a real mix of the type of troop types that you could encounter. You have things that you might call classically English weaponry, like the Old English had billmen, they had archers, but then we have the Gaelic Irish who have things like the Gallowglass. They have different types of archers, different types of cavalry between the Gaelic Irish and the Old English. So this real melting pot of military traditions coming together on the hill.
Backing up the documentary sources, the local evidence is encouraging.
All of the tradition and folklore and everything that has been handed down has been that the battle did start at this particular site on this side of the hill of Knockdoe, and that it literally went around the hill all day.
There's a lot to build a case for an initial geophysical survey, but Irish law is stricter than many countries when it comes to the protection of historic battlefields.
If there is weaponry on the site, the law in Ireland would state that it is the property of the state. So there are strict rules surrounding the excavation of archaeological objects and the ownership of archaeological objects. So what would be required is a well thought out research project with proper archaeological supervision. We're not talking just about treasure hunting or picking up nice objects. We actually want to get some knowledge and find out something about the Gallowglass and about the battle.
It will take some time for permission to come through. Meanwhile in Edinburgh, Paul MacDonald has started work recreating the Galloglass sword.
We are only rediscovering this knowledge through close study of the original weapons. The sword makers were known to be the men that used earth, air, fire and water and commanded those elements and made them into a functional form that you could live or die by.
Working from the dimensions of the original, he estimates the full length of the blade and draws out its profile.
Yeah, this is giving the blade back its lost life as it has been broken, possibly in use. It's quite likely blades were known to break in battle through earnest use. These are men who were fighting for their lives and would have put every effort into that. So broken blades would certainly be a result of that kind of action.
He's already crafted the components of the sword's unusual hollow pommel.
The pommel is hollow on the original and there's no evidence of it being lead filled or such. The only reason that a pommel would be hollow would be if you already had a light and fast blade. And some of the early blades really surprise us in terms of the technology, the blade technology, the steel making technology that they were capable of in these days.
The original pommel had the remains of the brazing inside it. This is the means by which the iron components were joined together. For this process, Paul uses another skilled local artisan. Lonsdale and Dutch are one of the last coppersmiths in Scotland using traditional sheet metal working techniques and tools.
So you've been in business here for a while?
Yes, the shop's been here since 1813, so it's just over 200 years old. Lots of the tools are around about 100 to 150 years old.
Brazing is similar to soldering, only it requires a much higher temperature, using molten brass as the binding component. Then, back at MacDonald Armouries, it's time for what Paul spends most of his working life doing: the grind. It's taken several months, but full permission has been granted, so it's now time for the first ever survey of a medieval battlefield in Ireland to get underway. They'll use geophysics equipment, mainly a magnetometer, only it's guided by GPS, which means there'll be no need for grid lines and pegs, which can slow things down. Damien has secured approval to survey 2 large fields on the north-facing slope of Knockdoe Hill.
And the only anomalies that are in the way, you know, the only features are these two piles of cairns of rock.
Yeah.
So hopefully that will help us orientate the survey as well by superimposing those onto the aerial photographs. And at least the field is a lot drier up here.
It is, yeah.
Because down there it's just like a bog. So it's quite well drained, it's quite firm underground.
Yeah.
So
no, it's perfect conditions.
Yeah, it's great.
Around 10,000 men came face to face somewhere here. Casualties are thought to have numbered between 1,000 and 3,000 killed, many more wounded. It was the bloodiest day in centuries. But over 600 years, the landscape has changed. How much? Tim and Damien have to try and find out.
The whole landscape has been subdivided into rectangular fields. And before that, the whole landscape would have been presumably open, or mostly open. And in that case, we're talking about a very large area of moorland. There would be very few things in that moorland. There might have been a few enclosures for cattle pens, or even enclosures for where people lived. So what we can see now is almost certainly mostly later, over the last 200 or 300 years. So we would need to sort of peel everything away and see what was here in the late medieval, early post-medieval period.
For Damien and Tim, it's all slowly starting to make sense.
We know that there was one army located on the top of the hill waiting for the other to approach it. So if you were going to be coming up here, you have the slope behind you. It's absolutely ideal location from a military perspective, the impact of the charge and everything that you'd be looking for. So yeah, I don't have much doubt that we're almost certainly on the site of the battlefield where we are here. The big test will be whether we actually find evidence from it now in the survey results.
This is quite an old landscape. It's the upland area for what is an extensive area of marsh and bogland around it. And so this is one of the places you would choose to fight a battle, in an open area of moorland on firmer ground and on the lower ground below us.
Wherever they were on the hill, it didn't matter. Gallowglass on both sides, harbouring bitter rivalries generations old, sought each other out. Oaths were proclaimed, names were called out, blades were crossed. When the geophysics data is processed, Tim and Damien consider the results. They haven't found an obvious medieval wall lurking just under the surface, but the good news is that they think they've found a relic boundary, the shadow of an ancient division in the landscape, which might have been marked out as a boundary in medieval times.
That boundary continued through into the next field, yet we know that it doesn't appear that way by the middle of the 19th century. So that boundary predates by 1, 2, maybe into the 16th century that boundary existed.
And it used to be a lot straight going across the landscape, and we can prove that by looking at the geophysical survey. But we can't see it on anything else. It's not on any of the modern boundary maps or even on the older
But it does.
maps.
It really raises the potential, because it does appear to continue straight originally on the geophysics, that it could be a medieval boundary originally, which, you know, it's a possibility. And if so, there is a fair chance that it might have been on the battlefields on the day.
Yeah, in which case, the burning question obviously, is this the boundary we're looking for?
Yeah.
We know that it's an early boundary, and we know that there's ferrous material associated with it.
Yeah, our geophysical survey has really, I think, produced evidence exactly what we would have wanted. We've known that the key topographical feature on top of this hill was a low wall that was a key landscape feature during the battle. We have evidence here now for relict field boundaries that could well be medieval in date, and there's no reason why they may not be medieval in origins. Now, of course, it'll take further investigation for us to say, are these associated with the battle? Are they contemporary with it? But lots of exciting questions, and I think it's definitely a real harbinger of things to come for what we can do on this site. There's a real potential here for us to find something significant relating to the Battle of Knockdoe.
Damien and his team will be back to continue the work they've begun at Knockdoe. At MacDonald Armories, Paul has completed grinding the Galloglass blade. He adds the finishing touch by hand, bringing a keen sharpness to the sword's edge using a stone. The final stage is to attach the sword's unique hollow pommel. The process of making the sword has caused Paul much thought, not just on what the original sword must have been like and how it was used, but also about what it meant to be a swordsman in medieval times, Scottish, Irish or otherwise. What it meant when your life was only worth what your skill with your steel bought.
This sword has provided a genuine insight into the martial culture of this time. The hollow pommel the form is necessary for the grip. The ball of the thumb sits neatly right in here, and the thumb assists in pressing and pushing a cut forward. So this is part of the grip right here. So it only gives us 4 fingers here, which nestle in between this shape and this shape right here. So it really compresses the 4 fingers in to a very tight and secure grip, which for a sword this light and fast is exactly what you need.
The traditional image of the Gallowglass is of big warriors whirling great swords. But this blade represents something more refined. It too speaks of lethal effectiveness on the battlefield, yet born of finesse rather than brute force.
This is a remarkable piece of engineering, and really it's been an exercise in minimalism. Minimalism in terms of the blade weight, the hilt, there's not much steel here, the grip and the pommel, the hollow pommel. So this overall results in a sword that is just a tiny shade over 1.5 pounds in overall weight in the hand. Really light and fast.
A fighter's culture, with form and custom to its martial arts. A way of life that existed for hundreds of years. With the end of the medieval era, the standards of society changed around them. Their days were numbered, but the Gallowglass remained the same to the end.
We have to remember about Gallowglass that these people could quite happily accommodate the fact that they spend their life killing people and engaged in warfare. I mean, if every person in the Middle Ages was denied the possibility of going to heaven because he had fought a battle at some point, heaven would be deserted.
Centuries of warrior tradition down through the ages. The bloody heritage, not only of Knockdoe, but many more forgotten hillsides of medieval Ireland.
We are standing on ground where people fought to death, because this was a battle where apparently there was a decision made that there would be no surrender. Then every single one of the people who lost their lives all along the hill here, I mean, they all had families and they had loved ones they never saw again, but that's something that you tend to forget when it comes to a battle.